Last time, Seleucus had fled to Babylon, and the empire was on the brink of another civil war. In 314 BC, that war began. Antigonus began his campaign by expelling all Ptolemaic garrisons from Syria, Coele Syria, and Phoenicia. This having been accomplished, he established a number of new shipyards along the coast, and began on a shipbuilding program in earnest, also making alliance with the Rhodes to provide them with timber and receive from them ships. Shortly after he had done this, Seleucus, now a navarch in the Ptolemaic navy, and in command of 100 Egyptian ships, happened to sail by Antigonus's camp, which caused his men to lose heart. Antigonus told them to keep their chin up, and that soon they would launch 500 ships of their own. Having gained intelligence claiming that Seleucus was heading to Ionia or Lydia, Antigonus wrote to his nephew, named Ptolemaeus, who was in command of an army in Asia Minor, with orders to defend against Seleucus. Ptolemaeus found Seleucus besieging Erythrae on the Ionian coast, but as his army approached, Seleucus broke the siege and sailed away. Seleucus, operating from his headquarters in Cyprus, then ordered one of his subordinates, Polyclitus, to sail to Cenchreae, near Corinth, where Alexander, the son of Polyperchon, had been fighting against Cassander. But while the fleet was en route, Alexander had given his loyalty to Cassander in exchange for governorship of the Peloponnese. So the fleet changed course and headed to Cilicia, where Polyclitus ambushed and defeated an Antigonid army, and then ambushed and defeated a Rhodian fleet, capturing many ships and men, and then returned to Cyprus. Cassander then sent 20 ships to take the island of Lemnos, and summoned Seleucus to aid them. They ravaged the island and besieged its city. The siege in place, Seleucus left with his ships to the island of Kos. As soon as he left, an Antigonid fleet swept in and broke Cassander's siege. Meanwhile, Cassander himself was preparing to cross into Asia Minor with his army to take the fight to Antigonus. Antigonus took the bulk of his forces and marched to secure the region and prevent a crossing, but left his son Demetrius with a force stationed at Gaza to defend the Levant in the case of an invasion from Egypt. Antigonus arrived in Asia Minor, secured the coastline, and then tried to negotiate an alliance with Byzantium, so he could cross the Hellespont into Europe. The Byzantines resolved to remain neutral though, so Antigonus encamped himself for winter on the Asiatic side of the strait. In Greece, Alexander had been assassinated, and the region had fallen back into conflict, with Antigonus sending generals and funds to support the campaigns there, spearheaded by the ever-persistent Polyperchon, which bogged down Cassander, and made it difficult for him to conduct any offensives to the east. At the urging of Seleucus, Ptolemy now marched out from Egypt, and arrived at Gaza, where Demetrius awaited him. Demetrius's advisors insisted that he not fight a field battle against a foe both more experienced and numerically superior, but the impetuous Demetrius's eyes were filled with dreams of glory, and he paid no heed to their sagacity. This was to be the moment where he stepped out of his father's shadow and became his own man. He deployed his best men on his left wing, and in response Ptolemy and Seleucus arrayed the largest part of their forces on the corresponding flank. Battle was joined first with the cavalry on the flanks, which Ptolemy and Seleucus were personally engaged in. Fighting was fierce and raged on, with neither side getting the upper hand. Demetrius at this moment unleashed his war elephants. Ptolemy had prepared for this, and had men at the front of the lines carrying frames of wood, with large nails driven through them, connected by chains, similar in concept to modern police spike string. Once these were laid down, the elephants were left unable to advance, and their mahouts were slaughtered by javelin throwers and archers. At the sight of this, Demetrius's cavalry lost heart and retreated, against his protestations, followed by a general rout of the entire army. They fled behind the walls of Gaza, but in the confusion, nobody closed the gates, so the Ptolemaic army followed them in. Demetrius kept fleeing up the coast all through the night. Once he felt safe, he sent an envoy asking for the rights to bury the dead. Not only did Ptolemy and Seleucus grant this, but, in a gracious display, they also returned to him his personal baggage, as well as certain high-ranking prisoners. They were there to defeat Antigonus, not capture booty. The rest of the prisoners were sent back to Egypt to be settled there. Ptolemy and Seleucus moved on to consolidate their position in Phoenicia, capturing many cities, while Demetrius, now based in the Tripolis, focused on summoning men from neighbouring provinces, enlisting and training new recruits, and writing to his father requesting more men and equipment. Ptolemy continued to advance up the coast, and in the face of all this success, Seleucus asked if he could spare men for an expedition to liberate his satrapy of Babylon. Ptolemy happily consented, granting him 1,000 infantry and 300 cavalry. As Seleucus set out for Babylon, he tripped over a protruding stone which, when it was excavated, was found to be an old anchor. You'll recall that the anchor was also the symbol on the ring that appeared to Laodicea, and was the birthmark on Seleucus's thigh. The seers were worried by this, suggesting that this anchor was a sign the expedition should be delayed. Ptolemy brushed off their concerns, pointing out that an anchor also represents safety, and so the expedition set off. Seleucus had every confidence in his cause, believing that the people of Babylonia, who he had governed with clemency for years, would rise up at his arrival. His men were more fearful though, as they anticipated that their little force would be outnumbered. Seleucus told them to fear not, as when he had campaigned with Alexander, it was not numbers or wealth which decided the day, but rather skill and experience, which he had in spades. He also pointed out that everything worth gaining is gained only through toil and danger. Then Seleucus told his men of his youthful visit to the Didymaean oracle, and how she had prophesied his own greatness. Then he told them of a recent dream in which Alexander stood at his side. Clearly the expedition was meant to be. The soldiers respected Seleucus for all this, and readily consented to his bold undertaking. Entering northern Mesopotamia, he gathered more men from the Macedonian settlers at Carrhae. Some joined willingly, while others were pressed into service. The army then travelled down the Euphrates and entered Babylonia proper. Just as Seleucus had predicted, the people rose up to welcome him, both civilians and a large part of the military garrison itself. Seeing which way the wind was blowing, Diphilus, the garrison commander, fled with his remaining men into the citadel of the city. The stronghold was besieged. An incomplete inscription suggests that Seleucus redirected part of the Euphrates to flood the fortress. And then it was stormed, and inside was found many of Seleucus's old friends and slaves, who had been imprisoned there by Antigonus. Now in charge of the city, Seleucus began to gather up more men from the local area, as he would need a proper army to protect his restored territory. The year was 311 BC. This would later form the first year of the imperial era in the Seleucid calendar. Nicanor, the new satrap of Media, who was acting as the overall governor of the eastern provinces under Antigonus, quickly raised an army of 10,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry and set out to deal with Seleucus. Seleucus's force only had 3,000 infantry and 400 cavalry, but its commander was cunning. Hearing that Nicanor was not far off, Seleucus marched with his army along the royal road towards Media, and once they crossed the Tigris, they hid themselves in the marshes. Nicanor arrived from the opposite direction and encamped for the night at a nearby royal way station. Late that night, Seleucus's men launched an attack on the sleeping Antigonid army, finding them in complete disarray. Many were slain, including Evega, the satrap of Persis. One account says that Seleucus killed Nicanor here himself, while another says he fled into the desert. In any case, he was no longer a threat. The rest of the army surrendered to Seleucus and joined his forces. The army continued to march along the royal road, securing Media and then Caesarea. His expedition having been a complete success, Seleucus retired for the season and wrote to Ptolemy of what he had accomplished. Back in Phoenicia, Ptolemy had sent Chiles, one of his generals, with an army north into Upper Syria to deal a final blow to Demetrius. En route, the army camped at a place called Myus. Believing they were far from any Antigonid forces, and generally having no respect or fear of Demetrius after his earlier defeat, they had not properly fortified their position. However, due to his spies, Demetrius knew the position of the Ptolemaic army and had forced marched a small army without any baggage train at great speed to Myus. Finding Chiles' army there, he fell upon them, and the army, totally unprepared for battle, surrendered. Demetrius had redeemed his earlier failure with an effort reminiscent of Alexander himself. Demetrius established a defensive camp between some marshes and wrote to his father of his victory. Seeking to capitalise on his son's deeds, Antigonus marched to Syria as fast as possible. Hearing of this, Ptolemy did his best to raze the major cities he had captured, and withdrew back to Egypt, where he could better fight a defensive war with shorter supply lines. Antigonus did not follow him and give battle, but instead sent Demetrius on a campaign against the Nabatean Arabs. After this largely indecisive campaign, word came from the eastern satrapies of what had occurred to Nicanor. Antigonus had been negotiating a truce with Cassander and Lysimachus, and then received an envoy from Ptolemy asking to be included in the peace treaty. Antigonus was the clear winner in the agreement, with concessions being granted to him in exchange for peace. Polyperchon, under Antigonus, would retain territory he had gained in the Peloponnese, while Ptolemy would recognise Antigonus's claims on the eastern satrapies, and thus allow him to persecute a separate war against Seleucus. An important provision was also made that the Greek cities themselves would remain free from the rule of any one of the Diadochi. His position in the Mediterranean secured, Antigonus sent Demetrius to retake Babylon with an army of 15,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry. Unfortunately, precise knowledge of what happened in the next stage of the conflict is lost to us. It seems Seleucus had remained in the east to secure his rule there. Plutarch states that he went as far as India, but this is highly suspect given the time frame, and other sources date Seleucus's further adventures in that region to after the war. However, Plutarch also mentions a campaign near the Caucasus, which is much closer and roughly fits with Diodorus' account, which places Seleucus in Media. In any case, he was not in Babylon when Demetrius arrived. Rather, a subordinate, Patroclus, was in charge of the city's garrison. When he had heard Demetrius was near, he wrote to Seleucus asking for aid, but in the meantime engaged in a scorched earth strategy, evacuating as many civilians as possible to the east of the Euphrates, where they could take refuge in Caesarea and the other parts of the realm, far from the fighting. Demetrius besieged the empty city, quickly taking one of its 2 fortresses, while the other continued to hold out. His soldiers sacked what they could from the city, and Demetrius withdrew the bulk of his force with all their plunder, leaving 6,000 men to continue the investment of the remaining citadel. Seleucus did not immediately come to the relief of Babylon, but continued to secure territory in the east through both diplomatic and military means, focusing on increasing the size of his army until it was a force capable of fighting against Antigonus. In late 309 or early 308 BC, Antigonus himself arrived to take charge of the siege, and it seems like he was successful in taking Babylon. Although a largely abandoned city was, by now, no great prize, particularly given the locals in the surrounding areas remained loyal to Seleucus, and caused as much trouble as possible for the occupying army. Shortly after this, Seleucus returned with his now larger army. The 2 sides met on the 25th of Abu, which was August in our reckoning, somewhere in the eastern vicinity of Babylon. After an initial day of fighting, neither side had gained the upper hand. That night Seleucus had his men take an early dinner and then go to sleep with their arms and armour on, arranged in their slumber in formation. Seleucus' soldiers rose with the sun and immediately marched on Antigonus' camp. Finding their enemy in the middle of breakfast, they attacked, routing the Antigonids and securing a decisive victory. Back in the west, Ptolemaeus, Antigonus' nephew, felt his contributions to the previous war had not been sufficiently recognised by his uncle. So he revolted and threw in his lot with Cassander, taking with him parts of the Peloponnese and the Hellespont. At the same time, Ptolemy of Egypt accused Antigonus of breaking their treaty by placing garrisons in Greek cities which were meant to be left free and independent. He sent an army led by the general Leonidas via the sea to Cilicia, which he seized for Antigonus. Letters were then sent to Cassander and Lysimachus to restore their previous alliance and resume the war against Antigonus. Antigonus himself sent messages to Demetrius, ordering him to Cilicia, and his second son, Philip, dispatching him to the Hellespont. With these spot fires appearing in the west of his empire, and after suffering a major setback in the east, Antigonus abandoned his campaign against Seleucus and withdrew back to Syria. Next time, The Allies will resume their designs against Antigonus. The formal Macedonian Empire will end, and Seleucus will begin to build his new kingdom. If you have any comments, criticism, or questions, please post them below, and thank you for listening.